Tonight, several members of the Shinnecock Indian Nation are camping out on the east end of Long Island.
They're protesting the tribe's treatment by New York State and the town of Southampton. CBS 2's Carolyn Gussoff has more from Suffolk County.
It's come to this, say Shinnecock tribal members, camping out for a month on their land off Sunrise Highway. Grandmothers like Rebecca Genia.
We're making a stand for justice and to bring awareness to the problems that New York State is constantly putting roadblocks in front of us.
And Margot Thunderbird.
We want them to listen to us.
Protesting state and local roadblocks to their economic advancement. Among their demands, the state drop its opposition to the tribe's giant electronic ad towers, one of two already built, which provides revenue needed to improve health and daycare, safety, and roads on the reservation.
It's land we've held since time immemorial, and we have self-determination and the right to dictate our own matters.
Tribe leaders call the encampment a grassroots effort by members frustrated with state and town intervention.
We don't have a tax base or tax revenue, so these economic development is, literally puts food on the table for our tribal members, and it improves the quality of life.
The encampment is following COVID-19 safety protocols. Southampton's town supervisor says he has no issue with the protest and is working with tribal leaders on meaningful economic development. The state continues to oppose the ad towers, but the governor's office says it's working with the Indian Nation on many issues. Protesters say this is about their maltreatment since 1640.
It's desperate. We're cold, we want to be heard, and we're going to be heard.
The encampment will continue through Thanksgiving, which the group considers a national day of mourning. In Southampton, Long Island, Carolyn Gussoff, CBS 2 News.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vretos. I'm a sociologist who started John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The Shinnecock Nation is one of the oldest self-governing tribes in New York State. They've owned and occupied their aboriginal homelands in and around the town of Southampton on the eastern end of Long Island from time immemorial, perhaps 10,000 years. They've never left, long predating the arrival of Europeans in 1640. In 1703, the nation signed a 1,000-year lease for 3,500 acres with the town of Southampton. They've endured land theft, land grabs, reneging of treaties, poverty, population loss, disease, marginalization, lack of unemployment opportunities, and numerous other threats from the colonial settlers. The nation has managed to primarily hold jurisdiction over tribal territory at Shinnecock Neck, a peninsula that jots into the Shinnecock Bay, encompassing approximately 900 acres, a small proportion of their original territory. They've never relinquished the rights to use the oceans and beaches they historically occupied. They're surrounded by the glitz, greed, wealth, opulence, and overdevelopment of the Hamptons. In particular, Southampton's overdevelopment has included desecration of native lands and ancient burial grounds, an invasion of billionaires to Southampton's Meadow Lane, also called Billionaires Lane, directly across from the Shinnecock Neck, has included Wall Street tycoons, Hollywood moguls, pop stars, a sort of glitterati, building multi-million-dollar homes and estates at a pace that is overwhelming the environment. Today, the nation has close to 1,600 tribal members. About half live on the reservation at Shinnecock Neck. 60% of the population lives below the poverty line. The median income for a family is around $15,000. In a series of recent struggles and protests, the Shinnecock are confidently and proudly asserting their rights as members of a sovereign tribal nation, no longer willing to bow down to individuals who think they're just going to take it. We're thrilled and proud to welcome one of the leaders of this resistance to the Radical Imagination Show today. She's Tela Troge, a nation member and a lawyer for the Warriors of the Sunrise, a group of Indigenous Shinnecock women and their allies representing the Shinnecock Nation in many of these demonstrations, lawsuits, and protests. Judy Jorrisch, veteran labor organizer and activist, is again my co-host for this show. And I'm so very, very pleased both of you are here. I'm just thrilled that we're able to present some of the very important issues that are going on out there in the reservation and in the Hamptons. So thank you again, both, for being here so very much.
Thank you for having me.
Great.
Good to see you, Jim.
Good. So, Tela, get us started for our audience. Just briefly, give us a bit of a history of what the people, the Shinnecock people, have been through over the last several decades. But give us a little history also of the legacy that you've established at the land there in the land.
So the Shinnecock Nation is historically known as one of the 13 tribes of Long Island. Our ancestral territory spanned from what is now known as the town of Brookhaven all the way to what is now known as the town of East Hampton. Wow. Currently, we occupy 2 tribal territories. One is largely residential. It's known as the Shinnecock Neck. It's home to about 800 tribal members. We also have another tribal territory known as Westwoods or Canoe Place in Hampton Bays. And that's largely a vacant area. We currently have 2 electronic monument signs on there, which serve as an economic development mechanism for the nation. Historically, when the first settlers first arrived here, this was a place of great abundance, and we had not only enough to provide for ourselves, but also enough to provide for the welfare of the settlers who came here for the first time in 1640. And ever since then, it's really been quite devastating to our culture and to our way of life. It's really fascinating when you open the Town of Southampton record books. By page 4, they are already enslaving Shinnecock fetuses, people still in their mother's womb. And it just gets worse from there. There are numerous court cases enumerated in the records where they sell Shinnecock people, men especially, into slavery, into the West Indies. There's land grabs, there's land deeds that are really actually treaties, which promise things that to this day have not been fulfilled. There's really, been a lot of inequity. And to bring it to modern times, the COVID-19 pandemic really shone a bright light on the inequities and the injustices that we're facing right next door. Literally, when you walk out to the edge of our tribal territory on the Shinnecock Neck, you're looking at some of the most expensive homes in the entire country. You're looking out onto the homes of billionaires, and on the nation, we're facing a situation where most of the tribal homes, there's about 250 residential homes, have really bad problems like black mold and problems from being hit by hurricanes and superstorms and nor'easters. We have a really bad problem with lack of capital access, and so we can't go to the bank and get a mortgage or a construction loan. It's hard to even open a bank account because we don't have postal addresses, and the Patriot Act requires that for most financial institutions. And then anytime we attempt to engage in economic development, the town of Southampton or the state of New York immediately attempt to quash it. And so things were pretty bad. We had a really high rate of tribal members living in poverty before the pandemic, but things got incredibly worse during the pandemic. We had an incredible rate of food insecurity, we had housing insecurity, right? You had to shut yourself into your homes. Well, here we had to ask elders and children who already had existing respiratory problems to lock themselves into their homes, which were filled with toxic black mold, with a complete lack of resources to address that. The food insecurity was another really bad problem, and it became a problem for our neighbors too, who traditionally didn't face those type of problems. Even accessing critical items for our youngest babies was a challenge. There was a diaper shortage. We really faced every type of adversity that there is throughout the pandemic, and it's really caused us to ignite and really actively assert our sovereignty and seek a restoration of how things were before colonization. So we're currently actively going through the process of asserting our sovereignty, and it's primarily so that we can serve the needs of our most vulnerable tribal members. These are critical human rights level needs that are not being met. And there's actually a huge amount of active resistance from the state and the local municipalities against us having, again, a functioning economy, which is so critically damaging to every aspect of our life.
Just for 1 second, go back to what happened in 1703.
So in 1703, there was an increasing amount of tension over land use. There was more and more and more settlers coming from England, and there was this attempt to redefine the boundaries. And so the 1640 deed, it's called the first Indian deed, reserved to the settlers 8 square miles of land. By 1703, it was quite evident that all of the newcomers couldn't fit on 8 square miles. And so they renegotiated an agreement where the Shinnecock people would have pretty much one of the first reservations, because when we use the term reservation, that's really a federal term to describe an Indian reservation. But if you think back, by 1703, there was no federal United States of America. And so what this agreement did was it created a boundary, and the boundary was reaffirmed in 1793. For approximately 4,000 acres of land that's now known as the Shinnecock Hills. And the agreement was that this would be reserved to the Shinnecock people for 1,000 years. About 150 years later, in 1859, the Long Island Railroad was being developed. And so the purpose was for this railroad to connect the east end of Long Island to Manhattan. And it was envisioned that this would become a summer colony for the wealthy people of the city. And so the only problem was that in order to run the railroad out, it would have to cross through the lands that were reserved to the Shinnecock people. And so a group of folks, including Samuel Parrish, who the Parrish Art Museum is named after, created this plan to petition the New York State Legislature for the Shinnecock Nation to give up its rights to these 4,000 acres of land in exchange for a deed to the Shinnecock Neck, which is about 800 acres. It's a peninsula surrounded on all sides by water. And we were forcefully removed from our tribal territory at Westwoods or Canoe Place and from the Shinnecock Hills and forced onto this very small area of swampy land where we were expected to just die off.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack there. Judy, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, it's
questions.
What strikes me is how it's possible that right in how few people know about what's
Yeah.
literally right among us, and how strongly many people would react to this if this history was more known, and if we were um, able to organize more support for what you're going through. I mean, the contrast is uh, shocking and unabashed, and I think the what some questions just that came to my mind in terms of the local government versus federal government, and what the current situation is, and the lack of resources. If you could explain some of the things that are supposed to come from the American federal government, and
Right.
how that impacts around your sovereignty,
Right.
and whether you can access, whether you're supposed to access resources that were made available to other people during COVID, um, or what are the barriers to access, and how are people, or are you trying to penetrate those barriers? Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
And
how does the sovereignty relate to that?
yes. And what is the role of the town of Southampton? You're self-regulating, but what is their role and as Judy points out, the federal government too?
So
Yeah.
that's a great question, Judy. So I mentioned that the 1703 lease was reaffirmed in
Mhm.
1793. And that's critical because the United States passed a law in 1790. It's called the Non-Intercourse Act.
Uh-huh.
And the Non-Intercourse Act was a promise from George Washington himself
Huh.
to the Native nations in New York that no person, no institution, no entity, no state would ever be allowed to alienate any interest of land owned or occupied by Native people.
Mhm.
And when all of the states ratified the United States Constitution, they agreed that the United States Congress would have supremacy and that the federal government would have supremacy over Indian affairs. But again, this land transaction occurred in 1859, and the Non Intercourse Act says that no land transfer is valid unless there is an act of the United States Congress authorizing any land transfer. And
Mhm.
here there was no act by Congress. This was completely done unilaterally by the state of New York. The town of Southampton, they
Right.
were a huge part of getting it in front of the New York State legislature. But it was completely against like the federal law that existed at the time and that still exists today. So even currently, right now, this week, we're constantly in negotiations with the United States government for them to use this law to protect our land. So we're what's called recently federally recognized.
Mhm.
And that means that we didn't get our federal recognition until 2010, about 12 years
Wow.
ago. But how that started was we put in a claim in 1978 for a non intercourse violation, and it was received by the United States government, and they had attorneys look into it, and they got back to us and they were like, we would really like to help you, but we don't recognize you as an Indian tribe. But we are starting a new administrative procedure, which, if you would like, we would take your litigation assistance request for help with the non-intercourse violation in the Shinnecock Hills. Will accept that as a petition under this process. And so this process was only supposed to take a couple of years. We're known as petitioner number 4 in this process. It took 32 years and
Mm.
federal lawsuits in order to get the Department of the Interior to act on our claim. And that was rooted in racism. It was rooted in racism, and we have that in black and white. And, President Biden has made a declaration that he would like to end white supremacy anywhere that it appears in the federal government. And so that's what we're asking for the United States to do. A lot of our tribal members are Afro-Indigenous, and the color of our skin has been used against us in creating federal policy, particularly the Non-Intercourse Act, which was passed during New Deal. It was a New Deal Act where tribes were supposed to come in under this act, the Indian Reorganization Act, and it came up again in 2009. There's a Supreme Court case, Carcieri, where the Narragansett Indian tribe were seeking to have their lands federally protected. But the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that the language of the IRA said that it was for tribes who are now under the federal jurisdiction of the United States, meaning now in 1934. But back then, in 1934, there was so much racism against any tribes. Like, a lot of the Northeast tribes are Afro-Indigenous.
Mhm.
And it was a way that the United States could justify the land theft. You know, they would say, yes, this is Indian land. However, there are no more Indians left. So this land, you know, it doesn't belong to them. And that's something that we fought against for 32 years. That's what held up. We had to prove who we were. We had to prove our lineage. And of course, under federal law, being Indian or being Native American or Indigenous, it's not a racial classification. Legally, it's a political classification. And so if you can show that you have a functioning tribal entity which has had relationships with local jurisdictions and other groups and states and the United States, then you can get this federal recognition. And so we did receive that in 2010, but it was for our people and not necessarily for our land. So we're still constantly attempting to negotiate. And that's where our sovereignty camp came up, because right before the pandemic in 2019, we built these structures, again, to produce revenue. New York State sued us within 3 days. They were able to get a temporary restraining order, which we did not abide by because we recognize that we have the authority as a sovereign nation to handle our affairs and our businesses in any way that we see fit. And so it took a New York State judge about 1 entire year to look at all the documents in the case. I provided a stack of documents like about that high, proving our ownership of our land at Westwoods and Canoe Place. And so after a year of review, a New York State judge came back and he said that the scales of equity tip in our favor, that we, you know, have a responsibility to provide for our children and for our elders. And so he denied New York State's motion to quash that economic development project. But the judge in that case went a little further and he said, you know, it's clear from the record that the Shinnecock Nation have owned the land in Southampton for many, many, many centuries prior to the European coloners coming over. And so it's all, you know, actively being litigated, but we have to really weigh it with being able to provide for our tribal members' immediate needs. Litigation is very expensive. We have a lack of resources. We're trying to do what we can with what we have, but it's an extremely difficult situation to be in. You know, the arc of justice has definitely not been bending in our favor. We're trying to advocate and push and keep the momentum up and share our story and try to create a wide network of allies who can help amplify our voice. But it's definitely been an uphill battle. In terms of making it through the pandemic, the early days were dark days for sure. However, the nation was eligible for the CARES Act as well as the American Rescue Plan. And so I helped my nation distribute those funds directly to tribal members. We made sure that everyone had access to food, including fresh food, fresh vegetables. We provided gift cards to the local grocery stores. We paid everyone's utilities, and we made emergency home repairs. But we really, we're only able to really cover the tip of the iceberg with the funds that we did receive, and there's still a huge amount of outstanding need.
Can I ask two questions about that? They go in different directions. So I'll ask one can you say a little bit more and describe what the economic development projects were and why they wanted to squash them?
Yes, so they were 61-foot tall electronic signs on Sunrise Highway, which is one of the only highways in the Hamptons. And in 1959, New York State unilaterally ran this highway through our land. And again, the 1790 Non-Intercourse Act considers any interest of land that's owned by Indigenous groups to be unalienable. So that's even a partial
Violation.
easement is not allowed. But New York State does these things anyway.
That was Robert Moses, right? That was Robert Moses who built that? Is that
No.
Okay.
Robert Moses was really on the west end of Long Island, more in Nassau County. We're all the way at the east end of Long Island.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so it's a partial easement that allowed them that highway land. Is that?
So it didn't allow them anything. They unilaterally granted themselves a permanent easement, they call it, but that completely violates not only New York law but also federal law, and so that's really at the heart of the issue. But it's been about jurisdiction and sovereignty, and who gets to control what happens on the land. And so I think it was quite shocking to the state and the town when the judge came back and he looked at all the facts and he was like, the Shinnecock are in the right here, and it's very unlikely that New York State is going to prevail on the merits. Yet here we are, September 2022, and the litigation is still active. We've had campaigns, we've had direct actions, we've had many thousands of calls to the Attorney General, Letitia James, thousands of calls to Governor Cuomo, thousands of letters and calls to Governor Hochul to drop this litigation. And New York State, instead of doing that, ramped it up. And now we are in dual track litigation. We're in the state Supreme Court as well as the state appellate court. Again, struggling to meet the basic needs of our youngest tribal members and our elders who still face food insecurity, who still face housing insecurity, who still lack access to just everyday basic necessities. And yet we have to pay an absurd amount of money to litigate something that we know that we're going to prevail in. And we've already had New York State judges say as much.
Right.
It's very cruel and it's very unjust.
Here's a couple of quotes from the Southampton town supervisor on this. Said he was blindsided when trees were cleared on tribal-owned land to make a way for these 6-story signs, which he says are more suited for Times Square than farm country. The town is appalled by what is going on. I mean, we are outraged. Jay Schneiderman said, "They will completely change the character of our community we have fought long to protect." And he continues to say, "It was clearly out of character for the neighborhood." You are quoted in retorting, "All of their overdevelopment of our homelands is really what's out of character."
Yes.
So as you put it, it's a political struggle, and the solidarity camp, sovereignty camp that you've created, the series of protests here within the last 2 or 3 years. It's not about the monument as such. It's about making, as Judy was pointing out, making this struggle clearer to people who are just totally unaware that you even exist.
That's such an ironic quote that this is out of character with our community.
Right,
Really,
exactly. And so you want to talk a little about some of those protests that you've been helping to lead here. The protests against the development of buildings on burial grounds, the the obvious lack of consideration of water rights, of pollution. Southampton has no wastewater treatment, and so you're the Bay Area where you're surrounded by this water, and as you pointed out, which you were able to fish in and so on, is totally polluted. You can't do it. And right across the bay, of course, is these billionaire rows. So it is so much of a political struggle. It's a microcosm, it seems to me, of a larger struggle that's going on in the entire country. And it's another reason to make this even more of an issue here.
So I'll give you a brief background on the overdevelopment, but I really encourage anyone listening to check out the film Conscious Point. And that was directed by Trevor Wormfield and features Rebecca Janea of the Shinnecock Nation, who is a very powerful advocate and for many, many, many decades advocated against the overdevelopment that is occurring and was occurring in the town of Southampton. Things got really bad again during the pandemic. There was a mass exodus of folks from New York City who fled out into the Hamptons. The Shinnecock Hills area, which is the area of land that was stolen from us in 1859, saw a 38% increase in population,
Wow.
which was higher than any other area on the entire east end of Long Island during the pandemic. And so what does that mean? That means that we have a sensitive area. It's the highest point of the watershed. It's the highest point in Southampton. It's bordered on two sides by water, the Peconic Bay and the Shinnecock Bay. It's home to some of the world's most endangered species, the most endangered sea turtles. The Kemp Ridley sea turtles, for example, nest in the Shinnecock Bay. And at the top, you have all these mansions who don't have any type of wastewater treatment. And now you have a 38% increase in population.
Wow.
It caused President Biden to declare our waterways a national fisheries disaster zone because over 90% of the marine life died. In terms of the development,
Wow.
we were able to actually, through the sovereignty camp, we caught the attention of rock star Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. And I worked with him pretty closely over the pandemic to acquire some of our most sacred burial grounds, known as Sugarloaf Hill. Really, all of Shinnecock Hills is burial ground, but Sugarloaf is a very prominent 3,000-year-old burial site, and we were able to acquire it and save it. About 15 acres we were able to preserve. Came at a very hefty price tag of almost $25 million.
Oh my God.
Which, again, for folks who have been enslaved, had all their land stolen, all their resources stolen, been blocked completely from the economy, is no easy feat. It was definitely a very, very difficult and challenging struggle. But unfortunately, in 1990, which also happens to be the same year that the federal NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, was passed, the town of Southampton issued a building permit to be built for a mansion to be built on top of our sacred burial ground. Full well knowing that this was a burial ground, having people like Rebecca, having tribal elders go to the town board meetings, protest in front of the town hall, work with local college professors, work with the newspapers to let folks know what was going on. And still, the town of Southampton authorized, again, it was a very big mansion to be built on top of the burial ground.
Who owns that? Can you say? Can you say who owns it?
Yes, we acquired it with the help of Roger Waters from Pink Floyd.
So you won it back. Fabulous. Okay.
Yes, and we just demolished the mansion. So there is no longer a mansion on top of Sugarloaf Hill, thankfully. But again, it's 15 acres. The entire Sugarloaf Hill Shinnecock burial area. It's an area that's much larger, but just again, to acquire these 15 acres was over $25 million. And so it's
Can I
really,
ask how that was raised?
Yeah.
yeah, Roger Waters,
Raised it.
helped
So,
us.
so these people made $25 million to have their mansion demolished. Not a bad deal.
Hmm.
Exactly. And I will note that 5.9 million of the purchase price came from the Town of Southampton's Community Preservation Fund.
Oh,
So a portion did come from the Town of Southampton, and that was after going to a lot of board meetings, having a lot of protests in front of the town hall. It wasn't something that easily just happened.
well, congratulations on that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Does this include some of the burial grounds? Includes the golf course, the Shinnecock golf course? It's also very near.
Yes, so there's well documented burials, actually of our ancestors being removed from their graves at the Shinnecock Hills Golf Course. William Dunn was the person who designed it. Samuel Parrish, the lawyer for the railroad who I was telling you about in 1859, he was a president of the Shinnecock Hills Golf Course, and so. He then sold the land after it was stolen from us, and New York State legislature created a deed for it. He sold a large portion of it, and he raised about $2,000, which he used to start the Parish Art Museum. But the rest went to the Shinnecock Hills Golf Club, and it was then developed by a Scottish man named William Dunn, who recruited Shinnecock people from the territory who were living in extreme poverty and didn't have much choice. Um, but he kept very careful records. It was almost a joke to him that they would very often dig up Shinnecock remains. And then in 1914, the state of New York sent its archaeologists to go dig up more of our ancestors from the golf course, and put them in institutions. Just a couple of months ago, we were successfully able to use NAGPRA to repatriate 14 of those ancestors from the Natural History Museum in New York City. But that's very hard work. It's very emotionally taxing work to have to fight against these institutions and then go there and then see our remains. And then we have to do ceremonies to apologize to our ancestors that this happened. And then we have to do the backbreaking work of digging graves for them and reburying them.
Wow.
But it's all over the Shinnecock Hills. That's why I say Sugarloaf isn't the only burial ground. It's just, you know, it's the only time since 1859, since the land theft happened, that Shinnecock people were able to reclaim any of that area, and not just reclaim, but also access. It was the first time for many of my elders, the day that I was able to invite everyone to come up to Sugarloaf Hill, and just seeing the elders crying because they had never been up there. They were threatened with arrest, threatened, all kinds of ways that to not be able to access our sacred burial grounds. It's really heartbreaking. Again, it's cruel, it's unjust, and that's the legacy of Southampton and the Hamptons. They constantly, even to this day, build on areas that we know are burial grounds. And so also during the pandemic, we were able to get the town of Southampton to pass an unmarked burials law, which is a partial win because the state of New York is only one of 3 states in the entire nation that lack any type of protection for unmarked burials. So we're still, trying to get that passed as a law. Both the New York State Assembly and the New York State Senate recently passed a law that we've been championing, but we're waiting for Governor Hochul to sign it. We're hopeful that she will, but she hasn't yet. And so it's slightly reassuring that the town of Southampton has passed this law, but it's not practically being followed. Like, it requires them to have a town archaeologist review all of the subdivision or really any building permits in this sensitive area. And currently it's not being done, and they don't have anyone on staff. And it was envisioned that they would use ground penetrating radar to make sure that no remains were being disturbed. And so they bought the machines, but then they said that they don't have anyone to operate them. And so, you know, well, it looks
on and on. Yeah.
not actually helping to address the problems.
Would you care to speak a little bit about gambling, the gambling facilities that you're perhaps are trying to develop there as well as an economic way of bringing jobs and resources?
So I'll say that back in 2003, on the same area that our monument signs are, we cleared some ground and we said that we were going to operate a gaming facility. And again, this was 2003. We did not receive our federal recognition until 2010, almost 7 years later. So we were basically an unrecognized tribe. Tribes do rely on federal laws to be able to engage in gaming. But we were sued again almost immediately by both the town of Southampton and the state of New York, and we went through. We were sued in federal district court. We had an entire trial, and a ruling came out that the land, the Westwoods land, the Canoe Place land, was not. We didn't have Aboriginal title to it, which is unbroken Aboriginal title from historic times to current times. And so we appealed that in the Second Circuit. Colloquially, the Second Circuit is known as the place where Indian land claims go to die. And so it's not a friendly place. However, the Second Circuit did vacate that ruling. They declared that the lower court, the trial judge, had no subject matter jurisdiction to even hold the trial. But there is the case law from that. And it's so fascinating because even now in 2022, I sit in meetings with the town or the state, and they try to hold it up. Literally, they have a copy and they're like, well, this says that this is not your Aboriginal territory. And I sometimes, I'm like, are you an attorney? Should you be making those legal determinations? Because it's quite evident to me that you don't understand precedents, and you don't understand that if a case is vacated, that you can't rely on it for precedents. And they're like, yeah, I'm the attorney for the entire agency. And I'm just,
oh my God.
But I think it's like something new for them. They're not used to tribal members who have gone to law school, who understand sovereignty. I've been taught Indigenous sovereignty from some of the topmost legal experts in the country. I understand it quite well. And, they're unable to do what they've traditionally done, which is just lie, scheme, scam, and steal. When they are faced with someone who knows that what they're doing is illegal and contrary to federal law. And so I think that's how I've been able to, be a little bit more successful than we have in the past in, reassuring everyone that it's safe to proceed on using the safety net of our sovereignty, where in the past, we wouldn't have really asserted our sovereignty in the way that we're currently doing now.
That's terrific. Can I go back to another point you were making, and about the black mold and what the storms have done? And again, partly it's a sovereignty issue, but also it's just a question of what you can access. So there was a lot of FEMA money for homes that had mold and damage from Sandy and other storms, and why were you not able to access that, and is it still possible to get some
So
of those resources?
yes, I do regularly meet with the heads of the FEMA agency, and they tell me that because the black mold was not directly caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, that they will not help us. And so I say it every time, and I describe how horrible it is to have elders and sick kids, because almost all the kids have respiratory problems from being
Yes.
with the black mold. Um, but so far it's fallen really on deaf ears. And trust me when I say that I bring it up with every single official.
Meeting, yes. But what about the predating COVID? What, I
So
guess
they
those
tell me
funds have
that
run out, right?
yeah, they tell me that the claim periods have ended and there's nothing that can be done. And even their whole guidebook for FEMA for COVID, like it covers mold, but they're like, oh well, COVID didn't cause mold, so there's nothing we can do. And when you try to remediate, because we did try to remediate a lot of it, but what happens is, once you take a wall off and you think maybe you have a $5,000 problem, you figure out pretty quick that, oh, this is a $20,000 problem. This is a $30,000. This is a $60,000
Oh my
problem.
God.
It becomes
Yeah.
very expensive very quickly. And FEMA really should help, but they have not helped us, and so far have refused to help us.
That's awful.
Unfortunate, Tela, we have a few minutes still left, and we want to make sure that people know how to reach you. Tell us about the importance of these demonstrations and protests and applying the sort of political pressure you're trying to do toward getting people to even begin to listen to what's going on.
So we have an Instagram, or I should say I have an Instagram. The handle is @WarriorsOfTheSunrise. And anytime that we need help, we put out toolkits. And so each problem is unique. So each toolkit is unique. Each ask is unique. Sometimes it's asking people to show up to a direct action. Sometimes we ask for people to call their representatives. Sometimes we ask for people to write letters to the town of Southampton. Whatever it is that we need, we make sure that we get it up on that Instagram page. Again, it's Warriors of the Sunrise. And that's been our strongest advocacy arm so far.
That's great.
That's right. And we do need to spend a couple minutes on the fact that you are a kelp farmer. You have worked to create a co-op kelp farm. Please tell us about that with 5 or 6 other women in the nation, correct?
Yes, so we're 6 Indigenous intergenerational women on a mission to combat the climate crisis. And we grow a crop called sugar kelp, and sugar kelp has an incredible ability to sequester carbon and remove excess nitrates from the water. And that's extremely important because as I said earlier, these mansions are all built on the highest point of the watershed, and they don't have septic systems. So they're dumping excess waste into the water, which creates nitrogen overload, which kills everything, all plant life, all marine life. And the sugar kelp that we grow is able to extract it and recreate an ecosystem that just attracts an incredible amount of biodiversity, marine biodiversity, but also a lot of offshore biodiversity. We see an incredible amount of seabirds, which we haven't seen in the area in decades. We see sharks, we see seahorses, horseshoe crabs, so on. It's really an incredible and beautiful project. And we're also able to sequester an amazing amount of carbon and really fight ocean acidification, which is a really bad problem for our shellfish, which we've sustained ourselves on for, almost 13,000 years.
I was going to get into it. Scallops, oysters, beginning to come back a little bit?
Yes.
Wow.
The scallops are having a really hard time, but the oysters and the clams have been doing good in our kelp farm.
Wow, that's amazing.
That is totally amazing.
Fabulous.
And really, you've been amazing. This has been an amazing show. I really have to thank you, both of you again, so very, very much. for letting us know what's going on out there. You've been so informative. It's really been helpful. We stand with you, respect what you're doing so very, very much. And please feel free to contact us here at the show, and me in particular, of course, and Judy, and we'll be out there. Okay, I'm ready to go on this.
Astonishing accomplishments.
Thank you.
Terrific. Carry it on and be strong. And thank you so very, very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination this week. This is Jim Vredos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.
Now that your big eyes are finally opened, now that you're wondering how must they feel, meaning them that you've chased across America's movie screens, now that you're wondering how can it be real that the ones you've called colorful, noble, and proud in your school propaganda, they starve in their splendor. You've asked for my comment, I simply will render. My country, 'tis of thy people you're dying. Now that the longhouses breed superstition, you force us to send our toddlers away to your schools where they're taught to despise their traditions, forbid them their languages, then further say that American history really began when Columbus set sail out of Europe, and stress that the nation of leeches that conquered this land are the biggest and bravest and boldest and best, and yet where in your history books is the tale of the genocide basic to this country's birth, of the preachers who lied, how the Bill of Rights failed, how a nation of patriots returned to their earth, and where will it tell of the Liberty Bell as it rang with a thud over Kinzua mud, and the brave Uncle Sam in Alaska this year? My country, 'tis all thy people you're dying. Hear how the bargain was made for the West, with her shivering children in 0 degrees, blankets for your land, so the treaties attest. Ah, well, blankets for land is a bargain indeed, and the blankets were those Uncle Sam had collected from smallpox disease, dying soldiers that day, and the tribes were wiped out, and the history books censored. 100 years of your statesmen have felt it's better this way, yet a few of the conquered have somehow survived. Their blood runs the redder, though genes have been paled, from the Grand Canyon's caverns to Craven sad hills. The wounded, the losers, the robbed sing their tale, from Los Angeles County to upstate New York. The white nation fattens while others grow lean. Ah, the tricked and evicted, they know what I mean. My country, 'tis all thy people you're dying. The past, it just crumbled. The future just threatens. Our lifeblood is shut up in your chemical tanks, And now here you come, bill of sale in your hand, and surprise in your eyes that we're lacking in thanks for the blessings of civilization you've brought us, the lessons you've taught us, the ruin you've wrought us. Oh, see what our trust in America's bought us. My country, 'tis all thy people, you're dying. Now that the pride of the sires receives charity, now that we're harmless and safe behind laws, now that my life's to be known as your heritage, now that even the graves have been robbed, now that our own chosen way is a novelty, hands on our hearts, we salute you, your victory. Choke on your blue, white, and scarlet hypocrisy, pitying the blindness, for you've never seen that the eagles of war, whose wings lent you glory, they were never no more than carrion crows. Pushed the wrens from their nest, stole their eggs, changed their story. The mockingbird sings it, it's all that she knows. Ah, what can I do? Say a powerless few with a lump in your throat and a tear in your eye. Can't you see that their poverty's profiting you? My country, 'tis all